I have long suspected this Joy-Con of suffering from intermittent stick drift. I say that because sometimes when I play Mario Kart, I just do so bad. And regardless of whether or not my Mario Kart skills are at fault, I made the decision to tear apart this Joy-Con and replace the thumbstick. I also went ahead and recorded the whole process, and that's what this video is. I'm going to show you how I did it. I'm going to go over how I replaced the thumbstick in the Joy-Con in just a minute, but if you're someone who's looking to have your Joy-Con repaired, you should know that you can actually get your Joy-Con fixed by Nintendo, most of the time for free. I kind of figured this was common knowledge at this point, but just in case it's not, it's fairly straightforward. It just involves you going to the Nintendo support website, which I'll put in the video description, filling out a form, and then sending them your Joy-Con. If you don't mind waiting 2 to 3 weeks to get your Joy-Con fixed for free, then sending it off to Nintendo is probably the way to go. Outside of a 2 to 3 week turnaround time, and the fact that the repairs could potentially cost you money, the only thing that might keep you from sending your Joy-Con into Nintendo is the fact that they could swap out your Joy-Con for a completely different one. If you have a plain gray Joy-Con like I do, that's probably not an issue. I would be pretty upset if I had some sort of themed collector's item Joy-Con, sent that in, and then just got back a plain old gray one. Having said all that, I really don't think that that's a common occurrence. I'm just pointing out that those are things that could happen. I get the feeling that the whole Nintendo repair process does more good than harm. If you've gone through this process, let us know in the comments how that worked for you. I don't have first-hand knowledge of that process because I didn't send my Joy-Con into Nintendo. I jumped straight into replacing the thumbstick because my stick drift issue doesn't always make itself known, and I didn't want to send off my Joy-Con to Nintendo only to have them tell me that there was no issue and then have them charge me for the shipping or any other services that they might have had to do. Plus, people kept asking me how to do the repair, and I kind of wanted to. Tools that I used to swap out the Joy-Con's thumbstick include a number 2 tri-wing screwdriver bit, a 000 Phillips screwdriver bit. I also had a plastic guitar pick looking pry tool, a plastic and metal spudger, and a pair of fine tip tweezers. The tweezers have a metal tip, but something made of hard plastic would have been the safer option. I just used what I had. The final tool that I used is my favorite, and I've linked to its STL file in the video description. It's this 3D printed Joy-Con jig that holds a Joy-Con evenly in place so that you can remove screws and work on the innards without the thumbstick causing the Joy-Con to move around a bunch. It also prevents the back and its cables from interfering with your work. It also works for both the left and right Joy-Con. This tool isn't necessary, but I think that it made the job a lot easier. I might be a little biased though, because this was something that I designed myself, and I'm super proud of it. In fact, I could probably make a whole video alone just talking about how I designed this and the features that it has. So let me know in the comments if that's something that you'd be interested in watching. Once I had all of my tools assembled, it was time to disassemble this left Joy-Con. I started by placing the Joy-Con in the 3D printed jig and then removing the 4 tri-wing screws on the back. With the back screws removed, I then lifted the Joy-Con out of the jig and ran the guitar pick style pry tool around the edges to create some separation between the back and front of the controller. Joy-Con's open like a book, with the part that slides into the switch itself acting as the spine. I had to be careful at this step because the back of the Joy-Con is now connected to the front only by 2 thin ribbon cables, which I definitely didn't want to break. This is where the Joy-Con jig came in handy. It holds the back of the Joy-Con and separates it from the front without putting strain on those ribbon cables. With the Joy-Con open, the next thing I focused on was the battery. All of the cables and connectors in a Joy-Con are small and delicate, and the battery connector might be the worst offender. The wires are super thin, and the JST connector is so small that it could very easily break with a little misguided force. Thankfully, left Joy-Con batteries are a little easier to access than the right ones are. So I was able to get a pry tool next to the connection and gently pop the connector upward. After disconnecting the battery, the next step was to actually remove it. These batteries are secured to the housing with thin double-sided tape. Stabbing, bending, or puncturing the battery would have been disastrous as it could have started a fire. so I was very careful and took my time, maybe too much time, working the flat end of a pry tool around the edges of the battery, ensuring that I was lifting up from the bottom of the battery and not digging into the battery itself. It was taking a little longer than I liked to get the battery out, so I broke out an all-metal flat-bladed spudger tool. The wider base of that tool made short work of lifting the battery out of the housing. Afterwards, I inspected the battery and was pleased to see that not only was the battery in perfect condition, but I had actually managed to get underneath and lift up the side of the tape that was attached to the Joy-Con shell. Next, I removed the 3 gold-colored screws using the 000 Phillips bit and worked on wiggling the battery compartment and the ZR switch free. This took a little more work than I was anticipating. Something seemed to be holding the compartment down, but I couldn't find what it was. Eventually, though, I was able to free that section. There was a very thin and fragile ribbon cable underneath that, but I took great care in not putting any strain on that connector. Lifting the battery compartment exposed the thumbstick, whose cable is underneath the battery compartment's cable. I'm also going to point out here that the cable for the thumbstick doesn't sit completely flat when it's plugged in. It bumps up. This threw me off the first time I replaced the thumbstick because the replacement thumbstick's cable not sitting flat had me thinking that I had done something wrong, but no, it's just that way. I had to disconnect the battery compartment / ZR trigger's ribbon cable since it covered the thumbsticks, and that was as easy as flipping up the latch and then gently wiggling the cable out. Whenever I remove or insert ribbon cables, I try to work near the head of the cable to help prevent tears. But I did end up pulling slightly on the body of the cable as well here. The thumbstick comes out by removing 2 screws, one of which is covered by yet another ribbon cable, so this one had to be removed too. I opened the latch, disconnected that cable, then left it in place. Then I went ahead and disconnected the thumbstick ribbon cable using the tweezers. Again, the metal tip kind isn't ideal here, but they get the job done. With all the surrounding ribbon cables disconnected, I moved on to removing the screws that hold the thumbstick in place, and then started to pull the thumbstick out. Lifted mostly straight out, but there was another thing that I had to look out for. There's a thin gasket that lays between the Joy-Con housing and the thumbstick. I had to be careful not to tear the gasket, which wasn't too much of a threat. The more likely concern was that I would pop the gasket out of place. I was able to successfully wriggle the thumbstick out of place without disturbing the gasket too much. Even if I had knocked the gasket out of place, I would simply have to realign it. There are 2 small standoffs that the gasket lines up with. Now that the thumbstick was out, it was time to head over to the parts drawer for a replacement thumbstick. As you can see, it's an aftermarket model and not exactly the same as the OEM one, but it's the job done. I lifted the ribbon cable that was in my way and the new thumbstick dropped into place with just a little maneuvering. I then went to work reattaching the ribbon cables, all of which were relatively easy to get back into place. The thumbstick's ribbon cable was probably the most difficult one to install, mostly because the port that the cable plugs into isn't very deep, and again, the cable itself doesn't lie flat, so it was a little difficult to know if I had gotten the cable fully inserted. Once the battery compartment cable was connected, I made sure that it was laying as flat as possible to where the compartment could lay flush. Then I screwed the compartment in, dropped in the battery, and used a plastic spudger to align the battery connector in place and then press it into the socket. Then it was time to close up the back case. Folded it back on top, making sure that the ribbon cables did not get pinched in the process. I also checked to ensure that the controller had closed properly, with all sides laying flat and not pinching or putting pressure on other components, and then screwed the case back on. The final step was to check the thumbstick calibration. The Nintendo Switch has a utility for that called Calibrate Control Sticks. It's under the Controllers and Sensors section in the system settings. The new thumbstick was already pretty well calibrated, so I didn't make any adjustments to it. Finally, it was time to put the Joy-Con to test with another round of Mario Kart. The controller worked great. I found out that the game's AI, however, is a big fat cheater. Now, there are other ways that I could have alleviated the Joy-Con drift. One of the more popular methods is to take some sort of thick paper or index card and stick it between the bottom of the thumbstick and the Joy-Con shell. And that's a fine fix. It seems to work for people, and I have no issues with it. My thought is simply if you're going to go through the process of opening up the Joy-Con, you might as well just replace the thumbstick. I got my thumbstick off of AliExpress and I honestly don't think I paid more than $2 for it. So with a couple of extra steps, you've got yourself a brand new thumbstick in your Joy-Con. But what do you guys think about fixes like this? Would you rather do an index card type fix, something that is super cheap and might contain something that you have laying around the house? Or would you want to go the full nine and do a full on part replacement? Let me know in the comments below. And thanks for watching.